Introduction. This video presents the English translation of a German language article entitled China, Neijuan, originally published in German in issue number 107, spring 2021, of the German online socialist magazine Wildcat, and subsequently published in English translation on the Chinese online socialist magazine Chuǎng. See the video description for links to these publications. This video is separated into these sections. 1. Introduction to the article by Chuǎng. 2. The article. China, Neijuan. 3. Summary. For a much more detailed breakdown of the article's sections, see the video description and use the timestamps to navigate the content. From this point, everything I say is a direct quotation of the text introducing the article and the article itself. There will be no personal commentary from me. That belongs in a different video. Introduction by Chuǎng. Below is a translation of China, Neijuan from issue number 107, spring 2021, of the German magazine Wildcat, fourth in their series on trends and struggles in China since 2018, the second and third installments of which we published here as Winter is Coming and Trade War or Redistribution of Wealth. This translation is directly reposted from Wildcat without any revision, except changing the title to the standard English rendering of the Chinese term, Neijuan, as Involution. We repost this article because it contains many insights into how things have been changing on the ground in China over the past year. It musters a multitude of data, original calculations, first-hand observations, and analysis on a broad range of topics from Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Africa, Sino-US relations, espionage, poverty, gender, and the demographic crisis. We hope this may combat the recent rise in international left circles of pro-CCP tanky positions on such issues. But this article differs from the previous two Wildcat pieces in its more despondent attitude toward the possibilities for the emergence of widespread linkages between workers in China and elsewhere. This reflects the European author's own frustrated experience in trying to initiate such connections over the course of several years living in southern China. Specifically, the article remarks on rising xenophobia and nationalism among different sectors of society, a trend that has only escalated in the years since the COVID-19 pandemic got under control domestically last spring, facts which have made any organizing difficult and have posed particular challenges for anyone seeking to cultivate a true internationalist perspective. The article also outlines an account of China's economic and social involution, consistent with the recently popular Chinese discourse of Neijuan, used to describe the widespread sense that no amount of hard work will result in happiness or significant improvement of one's conditions. Our forthcoming blog piece on suicidal protests will explore one disturbing symptom of this involution. We too have lost hope at times, and the present moment does feel like one of the most hopeless periods in recent memory, especially with regard to the possibility of a mass movement emerging. China today seems to stand in striking contrast to the dramatic mobilizations that have illuminated the world over the past decade. However, we caution readers to put such sentiments into a broader historical perspective. Many of the great insurrections of history, from the 1870s through the 1960s, all the way up to the Arab Spring and the George Floyd uprising, emerged from conditions where an economic boom was running out of steam, and simmering discontent seemed to have been skillfully channeled into some form of conservatism, nationalism, or racism. Those who witnessed such explosions often described how shocked they were that people could transform so radically in such a short period of time. Even in China itself, such rapid shifts are not unprecedented if we extend our horizon by just a few decades. Surrendering to the cynicism of our era is tempting, but hope hides in the shadows of even the worst repression. In addition to this divergence in tone, there is also an important difference between our own economic analysis and the framework used in this piece. This framework appears to be drawn largely from balance sheet accounts of crisis, as can be found in the works of authors such as Michael Pettis. Such accounts draw from classic Hobbesian theories of imperialism, which prefigure the later Keynesian emphasis on the lack of effective demand as the cause of crisis, and extended this logic to explain trade wars, imperial conflicts, and even long-run secular stagnation itself, arguing that such phenomena are caused by domestic inequality and the diminishing income of consumers. The implication is that a rebalancing of trade will lead to a reduction of inequality, rising consumption, and increased prosperity for all. This position has been critiqued elsewhere, such as in this piece by Aaron Benanav. See the link in the video description. Dismantling such positions is important because it also remains the basic ideological framework used by the Chinese state in its own industrial policy. For decades, the state has been posing its own goal in the same terms, emphasizing the need to cultivate domestic consumption, to reduce reliance on exports and US financial assets, that is, rebalance trade, and to funnel money into R&D to assist domestic industry in advancing up the value chain. In contrast to such accounts, we argue that none of these policies, even if successful, would reduce conflict, crisis, inequality, or the imperial inequities of the global economy. In fact, we argue that such measures will only worsen industrial overcapacity, intensify competition, induce further imperial expansions, and even then ultimately prove unable to truly diminish relative stagnation and the growing surplus conditions of labor in China itself, epitomized by the intense exploitation of gig workers, leading to several strikes and resultant repression over this last year, documented in our translations here and here. See the links in the video description. Rising informality and the discourse on Neijuan, documented below. This case will be made in more detail in the forthcoming third installment of our economic history. Article: China, Neijuan. The word Neijuan is composed of the characters for inside and roll, or to roll, and is intuitively understood as something like turning inwards. It can be translated as retreat or involution. It means stagnation or stasis due to loss of friction, or a process that binds its participants without benefiting them. Involution also means the opposite of evolution. Neijuan is fashionable right now, like Sang culture a few years ago, or currently 浑水摸鱼, fishing in muddy waters. See below. Originally used to describe a self-reinforcing process in agrarian societies that prevents them from progressing, Neijuan has now become the term that the metropolitan Chinese use to describe the ills of their modern lives, their sense of frantically treading water in a hyper-competitive society. Intense competition with low chances of success, be it in high school exams, on the job or marriage market, or when working mad over time. Everyone is afraid of missing the last bus, and yet knows that it has already left. Johannes Agnoli used the concept of involution to describe the, quote, regression of democratic states, parties, theories into pre- or anti-democratic forms, end quote. If you want to read more about Neijuan involution, please do. Abstract. Due to the length of the text, we follow the bad Anglo-Saxon tradition of putting an abstract ahead. The strike wave of 2010 and the struggles against factory closures happened a long time ago. For the last few years, the China Labour Bulletin records a marked decline in labour struggles, with a low point in 2020. While there have been protests by construction workers, parcel delivery workers, food delivery workers, and still some against factory closures, the protests have remained very modest relative to the sharp drop in incomes, layoffs, widespread wage arrears, and the harshness and irrationality of the lockdowns. Politically, the CCP was able to skillfully use Corona, and the massive criticism of the first lockdown has since died down. There is widespread fundamental support for and defense of the government and public figures against criticism. Even many leftists and critical thinkers ultimately assume that the state or state representatives actually mean well. However, it would be completely wrong to explain authoritarian structures as a result of brainwashing or East Asian characteristics such as Confucianism. Why didn't the Chinese government use the chaos under Trump for creating new alliances and to increase its own international standing? Why has it achieved rather the opposite effect by annexing Hong Kong, expanding forced labor and re-education camps in Xinjiang, enforcing border closures, engendering nationalism and border skirmishes with India, initiating a trade war with Australia, in addition to kidnapping and other forms of Rambo-type diplomacy. In Wildcat 104, we had explained the state's willingness to escalate was to form a blockade within China, where growing prosperity and continued CCP rule no longer ran in parallel. The strikes of the 2000s had shown that increasing industrialization could also lead to increasing workers' power. The phase of development of capitalist industrialized countries, usually called Fordism, managed to make class struggle the engine of development through growing private consumption and trade union rights, until workers' struggles from 1969 onwards plunged capitalist accumulation into crisis. The CCP studied both this context and the demise of the Soviet Union and determined to avoid this fate. That is why the system switched to authoritarian rule. This switch happened, as is customary in China, in the form of factional struggle when the paramount leader Xi Jinping came to power. Since then, state economic policy has attempted to stimulate the economy without increasing the disposable income of the working class. This exacerbates social inequality and entrenches the Great Social Divide. China is falling into the middle income trap precisely because class struggles are successfully suppressed as a transformative force. China will not pull the world economy out of the crisis, rather the opposite. Currently, the CCP seems firmly in the saddle, but time is running against it. That is precisely why it is fueling nationalism and foreign policy adventurism. How then is international solidarity possible? How can it survive the current phase without siding with one of the major geopolitical adversaries and instead stick to a class perspective? To find answers, the international left must stop looking at things through anti-imperialist and culturalist lenses and sharpen its gaze on Chinese class society. My own situation. In South China, where I live, the corona crisis has made contradictions more visible to me. It raised questions and caused conflicts to erupt. Since the Wuhan lockdown in January 2020, I have had to repeatedly rethink my political perspective on the world around me. This included many emotions that I now find difficult to keep out of a factual observation. Therefore, I will start with my observations. I make no claim to their general validity. In the beginning, my friends here compared COVID-19 to the 2003 SARS epidemic, which had a fatality rate of nearly 10% per case in China and Hong Kong. The initial cover-up from the authorities, general uncertainty, and lack of information did the rest. Like most here, I was very scared and hardly dared to leave the house. In the first few weeks, there was a lot of lively online dissent and criticism of the CCP and the government. This made me feel more optimistic that the lies and blatant lockdown measures would not be accepted without dissent. But the more the epidemic became a global pandemic, the quieter and smaller the criticism became. This was based not only on censorship and the relative success in controlling the disease in the country, but also on the widespread spread of conspiracy ideologies that either the US Army, Italy, India, or frozen meat were the original sources of the coronavirus. I did not go to China for a lucrative expat job with a lavish expatriate allowance, nor as an academic. I came on my own, had saved money so that I wouldn't have to work at first, and would have time to learn Chinese, and wanted to get to know life, society, and working class reality in China. China's rise to become the workbench of the world represents one of the most influential changes in recent decades, and I wanted to see that up close and make contacts. At the beginning, a lot of time was spent not only on learning characters, but also on recognizing and discarding unconscious prejudices. My guiding principle was that cultures which differed to the one in which I had grown up do not arise from any inherent otherness, but are a consequence of geographical distance and the consequent lack of social exchange. In contrast to the widespread idea in the West of the passive, acquiescent Chinese workers who were primarily victims, what stood out for me was the high rate of conflict and wildcat strikes, non-conformity, and everyday anarchism compared to Europe. Although at the time I thought that the image of the eye slave in the Foxconn factory was portraying workers too much as victims, I nevertheless joined symbolic protests in front of offices of international corporations that profit from sleazy and dangerous exploitation in China. International solidarity with Chinese workers and their struggles seemed natural to me, despite having never talked to them about it. Even back then, in the early 2010s, it was almost impossible for even a fluent Chinese-speaking foreigner to talk to Chinese workers during a strike. In the meantime, repression, epidemic, and xenophobia have further reduced my opportunities for contact with workers. A year or two ago, I was able to visit labour NGOs regularly, teach English once a week in a working-class neighbourhood, and talk much more easily on the street with truck drivers or warehouse workers. At the time, I wondered what international solidarity could look like, but took it for granted that it was right, important, and wanted. In recent years, I've had to realize that it's much harder. You usually run into the wrong people first, and the hopes and desires you project onto others are often the entrance to a maze. Since my encounters with nationalism, chauvinism, xenophobia, and the lack of criticism and resistance, I have developed fundamental doubts about the possibility and usefulness of international solidarity projects that don't consider the methods they use and the people they work with. My workplace: collective blockade due to competition. I have been working in an international IT company for several years. One good thing about the job is that, unlike in almost all Chinese IT companies, there is rarely any overtime. My colleagues are all Chinese, except for one Frenchman in another city. They belong to the urban middle class, but many without local hukou. See below for more details. I have no special role as a foreigner. My employment contract and my responsibilities are the same as those of my Chinese colleagues. There is no language barrier because basically everything is discussed in Chinese, which I now speak reasonably fluently. Racist prejudices and derogatory remarks about colleagues in India are common among Chinese team leaders. For me, it is also disconcerting that I cannot find the slightest movement of solidarity among colleagues. Everyone dances to the boss's tune, no one voices criticism or even rejection, and there is no discussion of any kind at work meetings. Resistance is expressed silently at best. People slow down when the boss isn't looking. But everyone is isolated. Most wouldn't even think of winking to their fellow worker in solidarity. Even in informal conversations, a critical attitude is almost never hinted at least to me, and I hardly ever get a reaction to ironic remarks. In contrast, I regularly see dissent, expressions of opinion, and defensiveness from team leaders and managers. If the boss comes up with modernization programs, the lower managers dilly-dally and stonewall. They water down the programs, and explanations are put forward as to why they are unsuitable. They pass the bucket. These mechanisms are very pronounced. My French colleague says he has not experienced such a kindergarten in any other country for 15 years. With this quite successful defense against modernization, even for changes that could reduce their own work stress, team leaders and lower managers defend their privileges and their power of command, often with a good dose of arrogance, and by turning against each other. Knowledge is monopolized in order to increase one's own position. All of this forms an almost impenetrable wall for the department head. Unfortunately, the colleagues at the bottom seem to have very little confidence in themselves and almost never voice concerns or objections. They are indifferent to issues of work organization. It seems like an act of mercy every time one gets an important piece of information, or even if 2 or 3 days of vacation are approved. Summary. That concludes this first excerpt from the article. Here is a summary of the topics covered in the author's words. 1. China has switched to authoritarian rule. 2. The government is fueling nationalism and foreign policy adventurism. 3. class struggles are successfully suppressed as a transformative force. 4. Nationalism, chauvinism, xenophobia, and lack of criticism and resistance are crippling worker solidarity. In the next section of this article, the author discusses negative trends in Chinese labor management, China's systemic racism, how the government enforces an authoritarian social culture and hierarchy, and the impact of government propaganda. Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons: Dusty Bob, The Boots Are On, Elias Asvig, Juan Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Sean A. Young, Andy Chaos, TVLTP, Thors, Fake Name, Niels Rethelin, Judge Sabo, Matthew Simmerall, Martin T., Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Jack C., Ezekiel Stacy, Love You More, Noah French, and Aaron Johnson. Please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.